Glasgow, 1968. The historic Scottish city was in the grip of a prolonged economic downturn. Local industry was in decline and unemployment was up. As is typical in these circumstances, poverty was rife and crime had rocketed. The murder rate in the city was one of the highest in Britain. Against this backdrop, the people of Glasgow attempted to live their lives. For Glaswegians, family and community was, and still is, incredibly important. Despite the challenges, the people of the city continued to work hard and raise their children as well as they could. One such person was 25-year-old Patricia Docker. Patricia worked as a nurse at a local hospital and was mother to a 4-year-old son. Her husband, from whom she was recently estranged, worked in the Royal Air Force and was stationed in England. During this time, Patricia had moved in with her parents. With everything going on in her life, Patricia needed a night on the town, a chance to forget her problems and let her hair down. Her parents agreed to babysit while she spent the night of February 22nd, 1968 at the Majestic Ballroom, a dance hall in nearby Hope Street. Patricia, wearing her yellow crocheted dress, grey coat and brown shoes, left her home and ventured out excitedly into the cold winter night. The following morning, on February 23rd, a man making his way to the lock-up garage where his car was parked stumbled across the naked, lifeless body of Patricia Docker. By chance, a paramedic was able to identify Patricia to police. The man recognised Patricia as the pair worked at the same hospital. Patricia's father would formally identify her the next day. The scene was cordoned off and police investigators would begin to attempt to piece together what had happened to the murdered woman. Patricia was found completely naked just yards away from her home. The state of rigor mortis upon Patricia's body indicated that she had died hours earlier. A post-mortem examination showed that she had been beaten badly about the face and head, sexually assaulted and strangled to death, possibly with a belt. Patricia had been menstruating and her sanitary towel had been placed close to her body. Her clothing, handbag, wristwatch and wedding ring weren't at the scene. Though we can confirm that her clothing was never found, there is conflicting reports about what became of her handbag and wristwatch. A majority of sources claim that none of Patricia's belongings were ever found, while some claim that her handbag and watch were found nearby soon after. The watch in a pool of water close to the scene, and her handbag in a nearby river. Little else of any evidentiary value was found at the scene of the crime. The early police investigation centred on Patricia having spent the full night at Majestic Ballroom, based on where Patricia had told her parents she would be going. It was days before police would discover that Patricia had only spent part of the night at the Majestic. At some point during the evening, she had made her way to the Barrowland Ballroom, a popular venue in central Glasgow. Barrowland was hosting an over-25 singles event they charmingly called Grab a Granny Night. It's unknown if Patricia simply had a change of plan that evening or was reluctant to tell her parents that she was going to the Barrowland due to the venue's reputation. This confusion over which venue Patricia had attended hindered the initial investigation. Police interviewed hundreds of people and conducted hundreds more door-to-door inquiries in Patricia's neighbourhood. One neighbour reported having heard a female scream, "Leave me alone," at some point during the evening. Police couldn't categorically say that this was Patricia, though they assumed that it was. From the gathered information, investigators surmised that Patricia had likely met her killer at Barrowland and that she had likely been followed home. In addition to the extensive questioning of potential witnesses, a public appeal for information was launched and nearby bodies of water were searched. Unfortunately, with very little physical evidence or witness testimony, Patricia's case quickly turned cold. The fear that gripped the city in the aftermath of the murder began to fade, until 18 months later. Margaret O'Brien had spent the night of Saturday 16th of August 1969 babysitting her sister's 3 young children. Her sister, 32-year-old Jemima McDonald, was a regular at Barrowland Ballroom and had intended to spend the night dancing before returning home after midnight. Margaret began to grow concerned when her usually reliable sister failed to return home by morning. Jemima was a dedicated mother and would not have left her children for an extended period of time. By the afternoon, Margaret had begun to search for her sister, speaking to friends, family and neighbours, and checking in at places Jemima was known to frequent. A day later, a rumour began to spread locally that a group of children had found a body whilst playing in a derelict tenement building. Most adults dismissed this. Margaret, however, felt in the pit of her stomach that this may be more than just a childish prank. She entered the abandoned building and found, laying face down, the dead body of her sister, Jemima. A post-mortem concluded that Jemima McDonald had been severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and then strangled to death with her own stockings. Her murder was estimated to have been committed 30 hours before her body was found. Jemima was clothed, though her underwear had been torn, and her stockings and shoes were placed beside her. Jemima was found to have been menstruating, and her sanitary towel was found placed beside her body. As in the case of Patricia Docker, very little evidence was gathered at the scene of the crime. Police immediately turned their attention to tracing Jemima's steps that evening and speaking with revellers and neighbours. Through witness testimony, it was gathered that Jemima was seen just before midnight at Barrowland Ballroom in the company of an unknown man. The man was described as white, aged between 25 and 35, standing at 6 feet to 6 feet 2 inches tall and of slim build. He had short brown hair and was well dressed and well spoken. Witnesses claimed the man occasionally inserted biblical quotations into conversation. Jemima was last seen leaving Barrowland Ballroom in the company of the man at around 12:40 a.m. She appeared to be heading in the direction home. A neighbour came forward claiming to have heard a woman screaming on the night of the murder, though police were unable to confirm if this was Jemima. Despite the striking similarities between Patricia and Jemima's cases, police did not immediately conclude that the murders were linked, though they didn't conclusively rule this out. Police did conclude, however, that the killer or killers seemed to have a strong knowledge of the local area and probably lived locally. Based on the description provided by witnesses, a composite drawing was produced of the unknown man that Jemima was last seen with. For the first time in a Scottish murder case, the composite drawing was approved for public release and distributed to local press and news stations. Within days, the unknown man's face was all over Glasgow. Undercover police surveilled the Barrowland Ballroom for months after Jemima's murder, mixing amongst the revellers in an attempt to identify the man. This surveillance was ended in late October due to no leads having been produced. Much like the case of Patricia Docker, the investigation into the murder of Jemima McDonald would slowly begin to turn cold. Sisters Helen Puttock and Jean Langford had spent the evening of October 30th, 1969 dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. At some point during the evening, Helen made her way to the cigarette machine and attempted to purchase a packet of cigarettes. The machine malfunctioned and didn't dispense Helen's cigarettes. A handsome, smartly dressed young man stepped forward and offered to help Helen. The two got talking and the man introduced himself as John. Coincidentally, Helen's sister Jean had become acquainted with another man named John, and the four of them spent part of the evening dancing and talking. The John that had been dancing with Jean claimed to live in nearby Castlemilk and that he worked as a slater. The other John gave very little information about himself, though he was noted to be well-spoken, teetotal, and would occasionally quote the Bible. Around an hour later, the foursome left the Barrowland Ballroom. The man that Jean had been dancing with, who would later be known as Castlemilk John, made his way across George Square to catch his bus. Helen, Jean and the other John hailed a taxi and the trio made their way homeward, their first stop being Jean's residence in nearby Knightswood. During the journey, the man spoke of his disapproval of married women visiting premises such as the Barrowland Ballroom, which he referred to as, quote, a den of adulterous iniquity. The origins of this well-known idiom can be traced back to the New Testament. Jean sensed throughout the 20-minute drive to her home that the man would rather she wasn't there and that she was somehow in the way. Jean shook this paranoia and exited the taxi, saying goodbye to her sister and the man. As Jean walked towards her front door, the cab took off again. On the morning of October 31st, 1969, a neighbour found the body of 29-year-old Helen Puttock. Helen had been stripped partially naked, beaten about the face and head, before being sexually assaulted and finally strangled to death using her own stockings. The contents of Helen's handbag were found strewn close to her body, though the handbag itself was never found. Helen's feet and shoes were stained by grass, and it was evident that she tried to scale a nearby railway embankment in an attempt to escape her killer. It was also evident that Helen had fought ferociously for her life. Helen was also found to have been menstruating at the time of her murder, with the killer having left her sanitary towel beneath her left arm. Unlike the scenes of the murders of Patricia and Jemima, Helen's killer left two significant pieces of evidence. The first, a bite mark found on Helen's upper right thigh. The second, semen found on one of Helen's stockings. Of course, at this time, DNA technology didn't exist, though this evidence would be re-examined decades later. Police spoke to Helen's husband and he was very quickly cleared as a suspect. The ensuing investigation would become one of the largest in Scottish legal history. Police established a dedicated HQ and over 100 detectives were assigned to the case. Jean Langford, Helen's sister, was intensely questioned, and within hours a composite drawing of the unknown man was produced. Jean described the man as being tall, slim and well dressed, with reddish or fair hair rounded neatly at the back, aged between 25 and 30 and approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall. The man was wearing a blue suit which had stitched lapels and a white shirt. Jean also claimed the man had overlapping front teeth and was missing a tooth in his upper right jaw. Significantly, Jean told police that the man had given his name as either John Templeton, John Sempleson or John Emerson. The man claimed to be neither Catholic nor Protestant, which is significant due to Glasgow's history of religious sectarianism. Jean informed police that during the taxi ride, the man had explained that the reason he was teetotal was because of his strict upbringing and the influence of his parents. The man quipped, "I don't drink at Hogmanay, I pray." Hogmanay is the celebration of New Year's in Scotland. Jean recalled that the man smoked embassy cigarettes and had been familiar with bars and pubs in the Yorker area of Glasgow, and that he had at one stage worked in a laboratory. Police also spoke with bouncers that had worked on the door at the Barrowland that night. The bouncers would contradict parts of Jean's recollection of events. They claimed that the man had had black hair and was shorter than 6 feet. Police initially considered the description provided by the bouncers to be more reliable than the one provided by Jean. This is because she was believed to have been quite drunk that evening. Investigators also had reason to believe that the killer may not have been quoting directly from the Bible, but may in fact have been just referencing it. These descriptions gave police not only a rough physical description of the man, but also an insight into his psychological profile, motives, and potentially his personal life. These details were given to the local press, and from this, the unknown man was given the moniker Bible John. The scale and depth of the investigation by Glasgow police cannot be understated. The 100 dedicated officers took 50,000 witness statements, interviewed 5,000 potential suspects, and over 300 identity parades were held with the help of Jean Langford. All of these suspects were eventually cleared, and very little of note was garnered from the extensive questioning of local people. Investigators examined the records of local dentists and even spoke with the 450 hairdressers in and around Glasgow to ask if anyone recalled the man's distinctive, short, smart haircut. Police spoke with taxi and bus drivers, hotel, bar and restaurant staff. They visited churches, asylums, hospitals, golf clubs and prisons. All of these lines of inquiry proved fruitless. Meanwhile, police also relaunched their surveillance of the Barrowland ballroom. Detectives handed out photos of Jemima at the ballroom, and music was interrupted nightly to allow for police appeals. A team of 16 undercover officers also mixed among revellers. Police believe that some potential witnesses from Barrowland may have been reluctant to come forward as they were in relationships and didn't want their partner to find out they'd visited the ballroom. The city of Glasgow, meanwhile, became gripped by fear and suspicion. Women began taking extra precautions when they left home, and there were attacks on men who bore resemblance to the identikit of Bible John. From the extensive public appeal, a lead on a potential last sighting of Bible John from the night of Helen's murder was uncovered. The driver and conductor of a late-night bus noticed a man matching Bible John's description boarding their bus in the early hours of the morning. The men noted that the passenger was in a dishevelled state. He had mud stains on his jacket and a red mark on his cheek just beneath his eye. The man alighted the bus at around 2 a.m. and was last seen walking towards the public ferry to cross the River Clyde to the south side of the city. This man never came forward and has never been identified. Police eventually considered that the killer could be one of their own, and many officers were questioned and ruled out. The officers working the case were becoming desperate, and the intense workload had begun to take its toll. Despite the extensive police investigation and public awareness campaign, the 3 murder cases would begin to turn cold. Many officers assigned to the case were of the opinion that the killer had either died, was jailed for another crime, was in a psychiatric hospital, or that investigators had actually spoken to the killer but were unable to link him to the crimes. Others speculated that Bible John may have moved away or perhaps only visited the city for work. Police circulated the composite drawing at all British Army, Navy and Air Force bases in the UK, Europe and the Middle and Far East. On a night not long after the murder of Helen Puttock, a man was arrested outside of the Barrowland Ballroom following an altercation with a young woman. The man resembled the facial composite of Bible John, and police were immediately suspicious of his demeanour. The man gave the woman and police the false name John White. John White also gave a false address. After police checked their records, the man was forced to give up his actual name and address. Though these specific details have never been released, it was revealed that John White lived with his mother in the Gorbals area of Glasgow. Senior detectives were called in, and to the surprise of the arresting officers, the order was given to release the man. A detective is quoted as having said, "John White is the nearest yet, but it's not him." As John White didn't have the distinctive overlapping front teeth described by Jean Langford, this was enough for detectives to dismiss the lead. Years later, the officer responsible for referring John White to the Bible John investigation, Les Brown, would speak with a colleague who had arrested a man outside Barrowland Ballroom around the same time, who had also provided the false name John White. The officer reported having arrested the man following an altercation. The man believed to be John White had sustained a head injury that required stitches. At the hospital, the man's handcuffs were temporarily removed and he was able to escape. Even with this additional presumed arrest at Barrowland Ballroom, John White was dismissed as a suspect. Among the many men to line up for an identity parade was John Irvine McInnes. The former Scots Guardsman was not picked out and would not be mentioned in the case for over 25 years, when, in 1996, his body was exhumed and a DNA sample taken for comparison with semen found at the scene of Helen Puttock's murder. John McInnes had committed suicide 16 years earlier in 1980 at the age of 41. A psychiatric report seems to suggest that the reason for McInnes's exhumation was the manner of his suicide, which an expert claimed indicated psychopathic tendencies and the search for, quote, the ultimate thrill. McInnes was cleared in 1996 as his DNA was not a match. Years later, an apology was issued to the McInnes family. There are some that believe that the so-called Bible John murders may actually have been committed by multiple killers. Police have never ruled this out, and some actually claim that Bible John is a sensationalist creation of local media. Could the Bible John murders have been committed by 2 or more individuals? Could there be a copycat killer? Some experts cite the 18-month gap between the first and second murders as evidence that these crimes were committed by multiple individuals. They postulate that most killers are unable to contain the urge to kill for this period of time. Other experts claim that this gap is actually fairly typical. Most people point to the number of similarities in each murder as an indication that these crimes were committed by the same man with his own unique MO. Patricia, Jemima and Helen had all attended the Barrowland Ballroom on the nights of their murder. 2 of the 3 women were seen in the company of a man, and all 3 women are believed to have left the venue with their killer. All 3 women were sexually assaulted and strangled to death. All 3 women were menstruating and had had their sanitary towels placed by their bodies, and the killer seemed to have taken trophies from each of the scenes. Though the multiple killer theory cannot and should not be dismissed, most experts believe that the Bible John murders were committed by a single perpetrator. The man most suspected of being Bible John is British serial killer Peter Tobin. Tobin was convicted in 2007 for the 2006 murder of Polish student Angelika Kluk. Tobin had beaten, raped and then stabbed Angelika to death. Tobin was also later convicted for the murders of 2 teenage girls in 1991 after a police dig at his former address produced 2 sets of human remains. Tobin had moved from Glasgow to England after marrying his first wife, whom he had met at Barrowland Ballroom. He moved away from Glasgow in 1969, the year that the final Bible John murder occurred. Peter Tobin's life and crimes are a video subject in themselves, and so, to keep this video strictly about the Bible John murders, I'll only share information about Peter Tobin that's relevant to the case. Tobin married 3 times, and after his arrest, all 3 of his ex-wives came forward to share stories of the abuse they had suffered. The women would allege that Tobin had raped, beaten and strangled them throughout their relationship. Tobin would become particularly violent when the women were menstruating. Tobin was also convicted for the rape of 2 teenage girls in 1993. He stabbed one of the girls before turning on the gas stove and leaving the pair for dead. For these crimes, Tobin served 10 years of a 14-year sentence before being released in 2004. As well as being a close match for the physical description of Bible John, Tobin was also a staunch Catholic and had strong religious views. Tobin is also suspected of having used up to 40 different aliases throughout his life, one of those aliases being John Semple, eerily similar to the potential list of names given to Helen Puttock and her sister Jean Langford by the man presumed to be Bible John. Jean, however, would claim that Tobin was not the man that she and her sister had shared a taxi with 40 years earlier. Tobin was also not a match for the DNA sample taken by police at the scene of Helen Puttock's murder. Officers close to the case claimed that the reason Tobin could not be matched to the sample was because the evidence had degraded over the course of 50 years and had also not been properly stored or preserved. Following Tobin's conviction, British police launched Operation Anagram with the purpose of tracing Tobin's movements throughout his life and potentially matching him with other serious crimes. Though several women came forward to allege attacks and intimidation from Tobin, including encounters at the Barrowland Ballroom, police have never been able to conclusively link Tobin to any other crimes. Nevertheless, police suspect that Tobin may be one of the most prolific rapists and murderers in British criminal history. Respected British criminologist David Wilson has publicly stated that he would stake his professional reputation on Peter Tobin being Bible John. In 2004, a sample taken from a man arrested for a minor crime came back as an 80% genetic match to the sample taken from the scene of Helen Puttock's murder. This indicated that the arrested man was highly likely to be related to Bible John. Further tests were carried out amongst other men within the man's family, but no further details about this potential lead are available. Though I think it's safe to assume that after 17 years, nothing further was produced from this line of inquiry. In 2010, the only living person to have engaged with Bible John, Jean Langford, died at the age of 74. There have been no further updates in the case, no arrests have been made, and no other suspects named. As it stands, Bible John remains unidentified, and for the families of Patricia Docker, Jemima McDonald and Helen Puttock, justice is yet to be received after over 50 years.